You guys, that's right, no pictures. No pictures, please. I'm an internet celebrity now because I have 23 subscribers, so I'm going to quit my job and just do YouTube full time. No, I'm like kidding you guys, but like, please help me out. I feel like I'm shouting to the void here. Please subscribe. Okay, but now on to our analysis of Chapter 19, and as always, we'll be centering our analysis on how to compare the Dressmaker with the Crucible. Okay, so a quick summary of Chapter 19. Teddy is dead. He done dropped dead. He did an opposite of Laganja Estranja. He dropped dead instead of doing a death drop.
Oh, y'all wanted a twist, eh? Come on, Season 6, let's get sick.
And what's particularly overwrapped about me saying that is that he literally dropped into a silo. So he literally dropped dead. Anyway, so the people of Dungatar give him a funeral, and this chapter is really uneventful, but there's a lot of material for comparison here. So, at the start of Chapter 19, we see the start of the section, which is marked with the title Felt, or the subheading Felt. So, we see in the description of it that it's interlocked with steam, heat, and pressure into a dense material. So this entire section is about the trials and tribulations that Tilly undergoes so that she can kind of break free of her trauma and become the final product, the ultimate boss, if you will. There's this concept of societal growing pains in the Crucible, which is kind of similar to the way that Tilly has to undergo these trials. Now, the Crucible is, the vessel in which you separate metals from other materials by raising the temperature. But Crucible is also a word for trials and tribulations, so that kind of works here as a comparison. At the start of the chapter, we see Tilly saying, "My name's Myrtle, I'm still Myrtle," and that's on page 191. Speaking of which, if you've been keeping up, you'll know that the shady sales lady at QBD sold me the one with the ugly cover, and I've been complaining about it. But I just found out today when I was comparing notes with a student that she had the pretty cover, but all of her stuff is still on the same page numbers, so you guys don't have to really worry about that anymore. Okay, so Tilly, the name Tilly anyway, is kind of a new way for Myrtle to present herself, and the name Tilly as opposed to Myrtle seems more childish and innocent, so it's almost as if she's taking on that name for the specific reason of gaining back that childhood innocence that she never really got to have. Now she drops that kind of new image of herself and reverts back to calling herself Myrtle. So we see that it's almost as if the growth that she's done is all for nothing because she's back at square one, ostensibly anyway. On page 192, she calls herself Morgan Lafaye, and she also calls herself a Banshee. So I wouldn't really analyze this unless I was really pressed for content in an essay, but this is just some context for those of you who might not understand the references. So Morgan Lafaye is this legendary witch, and she's one of Arthur's nemesis in some later adaptations of the Arthurian legend. So there's this kind of sense of evil to it, or to her, but she's really quite complex, and in a lot of ways she's almost a powerful feminine resistance against masculine or patriarchal society. Now, as for the Banshee, a Banshee is a harbinger of death, so it's said that when you hear the shrieking of a Banshee, someone around you, or you yourself, will die soon. On page 194, we see Molly saying to Evan Pettyman in a kind of flashback sequence that he'll send Marigold mad, and that's exactly what he did. So throughout this text, we've seen Molly kind of call everyone out on their shit quite accurately. She makes very astute observations. So there's almost this parallel here between Molly and Cassandra. So we've spoken in the past about how mad women are especially powerful and why Molly is made a mad woman in this specific text. But here we see this very direct comparison between Molly and Cassandra. So who is Cassandra? Cassandra is a figure from Greek mythology or history, you might call it that, depending on how you look at it. So basically, Cassandra was one of the princesses of Troy, and she was able to foresee the future and give accurate prophecies, but she was cursed by Apollo to have that power but never be believed because people would think that she was a mad woman. On chapter 189, we see that Tilly thinks of staying in Dungatar as a kind of self-flagellation, so that makes her decision to leave at the end even more powerful. And we also see that she says that all that was left for her was her frail, infirm mother, and that's on page 196. So when Molly eventually dies, it becomes this kind of freedom for her, where she's free to finally stop self-flagellating and punishing herself for what happened in the past. In his eulogy for Teddy McSweeney, Farrett says that he was an outcast who lived by the tip, and that's on page 196. So this is put here to remind the reader that he was an outcast, but these people now suddenly act like they care about him. So there are two possible interpretations of this, and the first is that he's kind of a political martyr for them, and he kind of acts as a catalyst for them to hate Tilly even more. He's kind of their rationalization for hating her. So, one way that you can support this interpretation is that on page 197, it says that they didn't truly love him until he proved himself an asset. So, we see that kind of sense of conditional acceptance again, where his acceptance and their affection and their grief over his death kind of brings with it a kind of trade-off, right? They want something from it. Now, the second interpretation is that people genuinely care because they can connect with that human suffering, the suffering of his family. They understand what it is like to lose someone who is close to you. And the evidence for that, you could say, is on page 196, where Sergeant Farrett says that tragedy includes everyone. So this is probably a good time to talk about martyrs. So, arguably Teddy is kind of like a political martyr, right? So his death could be used to inspire love for Tilly or hate for Tilly, and the people make him a martyr to justify their hatred for Tilly. So in that sense, he's like a political martyr. It's like when someone's life is given up for a cause, you feel the need to double down on that cause, except the people have kind of twisted the meaning of his death. Now, Rebecca Nurse is our traditional religious martyr. So she's someone who dies for her beliefs, and she's kind of this shining example of goodness. So once again, she fits more into that traditional martyr role. Of course, John Proctor is also someone who is a martyr, but he's more morally ambiguous because he wasn't made to condemn anyone else in a confession in order to walk free. He simply refused to give a confession and sign his name on the confession because of his own pride. So it depends on how you look at it, but there is a sense of moral ambiguity there if you really want to go there. But we'll talk about that in more detail when we get to the Crucible, because that's one of the heavier conversations that the text really focuses on. Now, I was discussing with a student today why it is that the two are so different in their approach, the two texts. And it really comes down to the content that they talk about and the approach that they want to take in terms of the tone that the authors have on the issues presented. So as we have already discussed, Rosalie Ham's The Dressmaker is very light-hearted because it deals with a subject matter that is heavy, but at the end of the day, the plot itself is not particularly morbid or heavy in terms of, being very heavy with the grief element or the guilt element of it all. And at the end of the day, it is just a made-up story. Now, in the case of The Crucible, it is talking about a real story with real people, and it's a real American tragedy. So that kind of accounts for the way that the stories differ in their storytelling, because the latter kind of favors this very direct approach to storytelling because it's not messing around. Does that kind of make sense? But what I will say as well is that in the Crucible, I would argue that one of the reasons why it's set out so straightforwardly and with Brechtian storytelling and everything is set out for us is because it wants the moral debates and the ethical debates of the play to take center stage. So they're kind of the stars of the show, right? It's supposed to make you think about what's right, what's wrong, and whether our perceptions of right and wrong are tied to what our society forces us to believe in. And it does this by making us look into this society that we would think of as very backward from the perspective of outsiders. So the texts really differ in their approach because there's a difference in what is meant to be the focus. In the Crucible, it's all about those heavy moral debates, so there aren't any tricks or gimmicks. Obviously, that's not my style of writing and reading, if you hadn't noticed by now, but I kind of respect Noah's decision to do that. Now, Rosalie Ham is more my type of writer. She's a writer after my own heart, but her story is written in this way because it's purely fictional. This is also a good point to talk about moral and secular authority. So on page 196, Sergeant Farrett talks about embracing his flock. So this is kind of odd in a way for a police officer to say, but it does make sense in the context of a congregation. So he's living his full priest fantasy here, but it tells us that there's this society here where moral and secular authorities meld together, and there's a lack of designated moral council. And what's funny about it is that there's a kind of duumvirate of Farrett and Beulah Harradine as the secular authorities or the moral authorities, where Farrett is the secular authority and Beulah is a moral authority. Obviously, Beulah isn't by any stretch of the imagination a kind of moral guideline of how to act, but she certainly polices the way that people should act in their daily lives. Now, in the Crucible, they live in what we call a theocracy. So, religious authority and the governing bodies are kind of intertwined, and in this case, it's specifically the judiciary bodies that are intertwined with religious authorities, because the judges themselves are deeply religious and they judge with religious or superstitious evidence as a means of kind of going about deciding cases. And obviously their court also rules on matters of religious and moral significance as opposed to kind of civil matters where people harm each other and the like. So obviously they do believe that witches are harming people, but they're also taking into account the moral and faith-based convictions of the so-called suspects in the witch hunt. So that's something to keep in mind here as a comparison. Okay, back to chapter 19. So on page 199, we see that the McSweeneys, they burn down their house, right? So that entire section on page 199 that starts with first there was smoke and ends in shrouded black heap, you can kind of mark out that entire section because it's important. It's the burning of their house is kind of like a symbolic cleansing or purging of the old so that they can begin anew on a blank slate. When Tilly leaves Dungatar, she also does the same. She burns down her home as well as the entire town, and that's because for her memories and her trauma is not tied to a single house, it's tied to the entire town. So we see the location of Dungatar itself beginning to feel hostile to Tilly, in that it's a reminder of unpleasant happenings and it also mocks her. So on page 200, we see that there's this square silo that sat like a coffin, and it seems as if it's mocking her, it's reminding her that Teddy died there. So we kind of see from here on that it's almost inevitable that she will burn down this town because it is a representation of everything that's happened to her that is traumatic. So thanks for watching, and yeah, I hope you guys learned something. I'll see you guys next time.